the surgeon's wife walked into a downtown Toronto police station, carrying a duffel bag full of evidence that would dismantle one of the most respected men in Canadian medicine. But 12 hours earlier, she'd been lying on her kitchen floor, counting ceiling tiles while her husband's footsteps faded up the stairs. Have you ever watched someone smile for cameras while hiding fractures beneath cashmere? Have you ever wondered what happens when the person everyone trusts turns out to be the person no one should? This is the story of a woman who spent 5 years inside a glass cage, and the night she finally shattered it from the inside out. But what she discovered about herself on the way out would change everything. Hit subscribe, because this story will haunt you long after it ends. Let me take you back to where it started. Tessa Obi met Julian Ashworth at a fundraiser for Sick Kids Hospital on a November evening when the Toronto skyline looked like frozen silver. She was 27, 2 years into her career as a social worker specializing in youth mental health. He was 41, a cardiothoracic surgeon with a reputation so polished it practically reflected light. He held her gaze across a room full of people who wanted his attention, and something about that focus made her feel chosen. Not just noticed, chosen. Their courtship moved fast. Julian had a way of making speed feel like destiny. Within 3 months, she'd moved into his Rosedale townhouse, a place with crown moldings so precise they looked surgical and a wine cellar worth more than her student loans. Within 6 months, he'd proposed with a ring that weighed heavy on her finger, in ways she wouldn't understand until much later. The first time he hurt her, they'd been married for 4 months. It started with words. Corrections, he called them, the way she loaded the dishwasher, the way she spoke at dinner parties, the way she laughed, too loud, too open, too much of herself spilling out in ways he couldn't control. You're a reflection of me now, Tessa. Act like it. She adjusted. She learned. She folded herself into smaller and smaller shapes, because the man who operated on human hearts seemed incapable of treating hers with anything but clinical detachment. The first slap came after a hospital gala where she'd spent too long talking to a resident named Paul about a patient they'd both worked with. Julian waited until they were home, until the door closed, until the sound wouldn't carry past the heritage brick walls. Don't ever embarrass me like that again. His hand moved so fast she didn't process the contact until she tasted copper. He apologized immediately, held her face in surgeon's hands, those famous steady hands, and kissed the spot where his palm had landed. She believed him when he said it would never happen again. She believed him because believing him was easier than believing what her swelling cheek was telling her. But it happened again, and again. And the apologies got shorter each time until they disappeared entirely, replaced by explanations that sounded almost reasonable if you didn't think too hard. You provoked me. You know how stressed I am. If you'd just listened the first time, I wouldn't have to repeat myself. Julian Ashworth had grown up in Westmount, Montreal, the only son of a father who believed discipline was love's highest expression. His mother had been a concert pianist who played Chopin with bruised wrists and never once spoke about where the bruises came from. Julian inherited his father's hands and his mother's silence. He'd learned early that power was something you held over others, not something you shared with them. The operating room gave him legitimate authority over life and death. Marriage gave him the same authority without the oversight. By year 2, Tessa had memorized the geography of survival. She knew which rooms had locks that worked. She knew the 13 steps from the bedroom to the front door and the fact that Julian could cover them in 8. She knew the sound of his BMW pulling into the underground garage, the way the engine note changed when he'd had a bad day, when a surgery had gone wrong, when the chief of surgery had questioned his judgment. Those were the dangerous nights. The nights when she became the surface he slammed his frustration against. Her family was back in Ottawa. Her mother, Ngozi, called every Sunday, and Tessa had become an artist at painting normalcy over wreckage. Everything's wonderful, Mama. Julian sends his love. She'd deliver these lines while pressing ice against ribs that ached with every breath, while covering fingerprint bruises with the same foundation she used for dark circles. Julian controlled the money. Her paychecks went into a joint account she couldn't access without his approval. Her phone had tracking software he'd installed under the guise of safety. Her friendships had been pruned down to nothing, because every person she cared about was someone he could threaten. Have you ever been so isolated that your own reflection felt like the only person who understood you? What would you do if the person who was supposed to protect you was the one you needed protection from? The turning point came on a Wednesday in March, during year 3. Tessa was at work, sitting across from a 17-year-old girl named Mika, who'd come in with bruises on her arms and a story about falling downstairs. Tessa had heard the story before. She'd told that story before, And something about watching this teenager perform the same choreography of lies that Tessa performed every day cracked something open inside her chest. She couldn't save herself yet. But she could start building the ladder. That night, Tessa bought a burner phone from a convenience store on Dundas Street, paying cash. She hid it inside a box of tampons under the bathroom sink, the one place Julian would never look because he found menstruation distasteful. Over the next 2 years, that phone became her lifeline, her weapon, and her witness. She started documenting everything: photographs of bruises with timestamps, voice recordings captured by the phone hidden in her coat pocket during his worst episodes, screenshots of the tracking app he'd installed, bank statements showing how he controlled every dollar, medical records from the 3 emergency room visits she'd made to hospitals outside their neighborhood, places where Julian's name didn't open doors and close mouths. She also called her cousin. Zara Okafor was a family lawyer in Vancouver who'd spent 8 years handling domestic violence cases. When Tessa called her at 2 in the morning, whispering from the bathroom floor, Zara didn't ask unnecessary questions. She didn't say leave him, because she knew from professional experience that leaving was the most dangerous moment in an abusive relationship. 7 out of 10 domestic homicides happen when the victim tries to leave or shortly after. Instead, Zara said, "We build a case so airtight he can't breathe." For 2 years, Tessa and Zara worked in parallel. Tessa gathered evidence from inside the cage. Zara assembled the legal framework from the outside. They communicated through encrypted messages on the burner phone, timing their exchanges for moments when Julian was in surgery. The only hours Tessa could guarantee he wasn't monitoring her. Tessa also began volunteering at a women's shelter on Bloor Street during her lunch breaks, telling Julian she was attending a yoga class. There, she met other women living the same story with different names. She learned about safety planning, about exit strategies, about the network of shelters and safe houses that stretched across Ontario like an underground railroad for women fleeing violence. She was preparing. Every day she smiled at Julian across their breakfast table. She was building one more rung of the ladder that would carry her out. But Julian noticed nothing. Because Julian had never seen Tessa as a person capable of strategy. She was decorative, functional, an extension of his image. The idea that she might be thinking, planning, documenting, it never occurred to him. That was his fatal miscalculation. Have you ever underestimated someone so completely that you didn't see them building your downfall right in front of you? The night everything changed started like 100 nights before it. Julian came home from the hospital at 11:15. A patient had died on his table, a 43-year-old mother of 2 whose mitral valve had given out mid-surgery. He dropped his coat on the floor instead of hanging it, which was the first warning sign. He poured scotch without ice, which was the second. Tessa was in the study, her burner phone tucked into her bra, recording. "Why aren't you in bed?" His voice carried that terrifying softness, the one that sounded almost gentle if you didn't know. It was the sound a predator makes before striking. "I was reading. I didn't hear you come in." "You didn't hear me because you weren't listening. You never listens." He crossed the room in 4 steps. His hand closed around her upper arm with the precision of a man who knew exactly how much pressure to apply before bone cracked. He'd told her once, during a calmer moment, that he could feel the difference between tissue resistance and fracture point. He said it like it was interesting medical trivia. She heard it as a death threat wearing a lab coat. "I lost a patient today, a mother, 2 kids, and I come home to what? A wife who can't even bother to greet me at the door." The blow caught her across the temple. Stars erupted behind her eyes, and she went down hard against the desk, scattering papers and a ceramic mug that shattered against the hardwood. Coffee spread like a dark stain, and Tessa thought, absurdly, that it looked like a Rorschach test. She wondered what Julian would see in it. Probably his own reflection. He hit her twice more, once in the ribs, once across the back of her head as she tried to curl into a protective ball. Then he stood over her, breathing hard, and delivered the line he always delivered. "Clean yourself up, I have rounds at 6. He walked upstairs. The bedroom door closed, and Tessa lay on the floor with blood running from a cut above her eyebrow, her broken phone recording everything. But tonight was different. Tonight was the last time. She waited until his breathing turned heavy and rhythmic through the ceiling. Then she moved, quietly, methodically, with the precision of someone who'd rehearsed this moment 1,000 times in her head. From the bathroom, the burner phone. From the closet, a packed bag she'd hidden behind winter coats Julian never wore. From the safe in his study, a USB drive containing copies of every recording, every photograph, every piece of evidence she'd gathered over 2 years. Julian didn't know about the USB drive because Julian didn't know Tessa had watched him enter his safe, code reflected in the study window. Surgeon's fingers, predictable patterns. His code was the date of his first successful solo surgery. Of course it was. She called Zara from the garage, voice steady despite the blood drying on her face. "It's tonight, I'm ready." Zara's voice carried the weight of 2 years of preparation. "Go to the harborfront shelter. I'll have everything filed by morning." Tessa drove Julian's second car, a Mercedes he kept for weekends, through empty Toronto streets at 2 in the morning. She left her tracked phone on the kitchen counter, screen shattered. She left her wedding ring on his nightstand. She left drops of blood on the floor, not intentionally, but because head wounds bleed and she didn't have time to clean up. She did not leave a note. Some departures don't require explanation. What would you do if you had one chance to escape? Would you take it, even if it meant losing everything you'd built? Julian woke at 5:45 to silence, no coffee brewing, no movement downstairs. Just the hollow sound of a house that had stopped pretending to be a home. He found the blood first. Dark spots trailing from the study through the hallway to the garage. Then the shattered phone, then the missing car, then the ring, sitting on his nightstand like an accusation he couldn't answer. His first instinct was rage. How dare she? His second was panic. Where would she go? His third, the one that would define the next 72 hours, was calculation. He needed to control the narrative before she did. He called the hospital and canceled his morning surgeries, citing a family emergency. He called Tessa's mother in Ottawa. "Ngozi, have you heard from Tessa? I'm worried about her. She wasn't feeling well last night and now she's gone." Ngozi Obi was 71 years old and sharper than Julian had ever given her credit for. She heard something in his voice that she'd been listening for since the day her daughter stopped visiting for holidays. "What did you do to my child, Julian?" The question stopped him cold. He stammered through a denial, but Ngozi had already hung up. She was already calling Zara. By 9 that morning, Julian's calculated damage control was already failing. Couldn't track Tessa's phone because she'd left it behind. He couldn't freeze her accounts because she didn't have any. He'd made sure of that, which meant she had nothing he could leverage. He couldn't call her friends because he'd systematically eliminated them over 5 years. He was left with the particular helplessness of a man who'd built a prison so perfectly that when the prisoner escaped, he realized the walls had been keeping him trapped too. Then the email arrived. It came to his hospital address at 10:14, from an account he didn't recognize. The subject line read, "Dr. Julian Ashworth. Conduct review." Inside was a single video file and 3 words, "Your colleagues should see this." The video was 37 seconds long. Julian in their kitchen backhanding Tessa so hard she hit the refrigerator. The audio was crystal clear, capturing not just the impact but his words afterward. "You're nothing without me. Understand? Nothing." Julian's hands went cold. He closed the email, opened it again, closed it. The timestamp on the video was from 8 months ago. She'd been recording for 8 months? No, longer. She'd been recording, and he'd never known. His phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. That was just the preview. The College of Physicians gets the full collection at noon unless you're sitting in a police station by then. Have you ever watched someone realize, in real time, that they've been outsmarted by the person they thought they owned? Julian did not go to the police. Instead, he called his lawyer, a man named Gerald Hastings, who charged $900 an hour, and had spent 30 years protecting wealthy men from the consequences of their behavior. Gerald's advice was immediate and clinical. Get ahead of this. Voluntary disclosure to the hospital. Frame it as a mental health crisis. Stress from surgery, diminished capacity. But Zara had already moved faster. At 11:45 that morning, a courier delivered a package to the chief of surgery at Toronto Western Hospital. Inside was a USB drive containing 2 years of documentation, 114 photographs of injuries, 47 audio recordings, 14 video files, 3 emergency room reports from hospitals across the GTA, bank records showing financial abuse, phone records showing surveillance, a sworn affidavit from Tessa, notarized by Zara in Vancouver and couriered overnight. The cover letter, written in Zara's precise legal language, was addressed to Dr. Eleanor Cho, Chief of Surgery, and CC'd to the College of Physicians and Surgeons of Ontario, the Ontario Provincial Police, and 3 journalists at the Globe and Mail, the Toronto Star, and CBC News. By 2 that afternoon, Julian Ashworth had been suspended from surgical practice pending investigation. By 4, 2 detectives from 52 Division arrived at his Rosedale townhouse with a warrant. By 6, he was sitting in an interview room at police headquarters while a detective named Constable Rayam laid out the evidence with the methodical patience of someone who'd been waiting for this kind of case. "Dr. Ashworth, we have 114 photographs, 47 audio recordings, and 14 video files documenting a pattern of assault over a period of at least 2 years. Your wife has provided a sworn statement. 3 hospitals have confirmed treatment for injuries consistent with domestic violence. Would you like to tell us your version? Julian's version lasted 11 minutes before his lawyer told him to stop talking. Have you ever seen a man who controlled everything suddenly realize he controlled nothing? The arraignment happened 3 weeks later in a courtroom on University Avenue. Julian arrived in a suit that cost more than most people's mortgage payments, flanked by Gerald Hastings and a junior associate whose job was carrying boxes of legal documents that couldn't undo 2 years of evidence. Tessa sat in the gallery with Zara on one side and her mother on the other. She'd spent the previous 3 weeks at the harborfront shelter, then moved into a furnished apartment in the annex that Zara had arranged through the shelter network. She'd gone back to work at the youth mental health clinic. She'd started sleeping through the night for the first time in 5 years. Looking at Julian across the courtroom, she saw something she'd never seen before. Fear. Not the controlled, weaponized fear he'd used against her, but the animal kind. The kind that comes when you realize the cage door has locked behind you. The Crown Attorney presented the evidence with devastating efficiency. Each piece built on the last, constructing a portrait of systematic abuse that left no room for the carefully cultivated image Julian had maintained for 15 years. The surgeon who saved lives on the operating table had spent his evenings destroying one in his own home. Julian's lawyer attempted to frame the violence as isolated incidents triggered by professional stress. The judge, Justice Marguerite Bouchard, shut that down with a single sentence. Dr. Ashworth, stress is not a defense for assault. Surgeons who cannot manage their emotions without resorting to violence against their partners should not be trusted to manage them while holding a scalpel either. Julian pled guilty to 12 counts of assault, 3 counts of assault causing bodily harm, and 1 count of criminal harassment. Justice Bouchard sentenced him to 7 years in federal custody, with no possibility of parole for 3.5 years. She also issued a lifetime restraining order and recommended that the College of Physicians revoke his medical license permanently. The college complied within the month. When the sentence was read, Julian looked at Tessa across the courtroom. She held his gaze without flinching. 5 years of flinching had ended, and she wanted him to see what her face looked like without fear on it. How does it feel to watch someone face real consequences for the harm they've caused? Is 7 years enough? The story could have ended there. Justice served, abuser imprisoned, survivor safe. But Tessa Obi wasn't finished. 6 months after Julian's conviction, Tessa and Zara launched the Obi Okafor Foundation from a converted storefront on Queen Street West. The name was deliberate. Not Julian's name, not a victim's name, but a family name. 2 women who'd turned evidence into liberation. The foundation operated on a simple principle that Tessa had learned from her own experience. The most dangerous thing about domestic violence isn't the violence itself. It's the isolation. When you believe no one sees you, no one hears you, no one will help you, you stay. Not because you're weak, but because you're alone. The foundation's first program was a documentation toolkit. Tessa worked with tech developers to create a phone app disguised as a recipe organizer. Inside it contained encrypted storage for photographs, audio recordings, and written accounts. It uploaded automatically to a secure cloud server that an abuser couldn't access even if they found the phone. The app launched across Ontario and within its first year was downloaded over 40,000 times. The second program was a legal clinic staffed by family lawyers who worked pro bono, trained by Zara to handle the specific complexities of domestic violence cases. Financial abuse, coercive control, technology facilitated stalking. The clinic helped 312 women obtain restraining orders in its first 18 months. The third program was Tessa's favorite, a youth education initiative that went into high schools across the GTA, teaching teenagers to recognize the early warning signs of controlling relationships. The program was called Rung by Rung. After the latter, Tessa had spent 2 years building inside her own prison. My husband was a surgeon, Tessa told a room full of 11th graders at a school in Scarborough. He could repair a human heart in 4 hours, but he spent 5 years trying to break mine. The difference between us is that hearts he fixed in the operating room went home healed. I went home to be broken again. Leaving wasn't one decision. It was 1,000 small decisions made over 2 years. Each one was a rung on a ladder I couldn't see the top of. But I kept climbing because the alternative was staying on the floor. The students listened in the kind of silence that only happens when someone is telling a truth that costs them something. If you see someone climbing, Tessa said, don't pull the ladder away, hold it steady. What would you build from the worst chapter of your life? Would you turn your pain into something that protects others? 2 years after his conviction, Julian Ashworth sent a letter to the foundation, not to Tessa directly, but to the general address. The letter was written in the precise handwriting of a surgeon and the broken syntax of a man who'd finally run out of excuses. He didn't ask for forgiveness, he didn't offer explanations. He wrote about the prison counseling program he'd been required to attend and the moment, 7 months in, when another inmate described hitting his girlfriend and Julian heard his own voice coming out of a stranger's mouth. I told myself I was disciplining her, Julian wrote. The way my father disciplined my mother. The way I was disciplined. I told myself it was love because love was the only word I had for the feeling of needing to control everything around me. It wasn't love. It was cowardice dressed up in expensive suits. Tessa read the letter in her office on Queen Street, with winter light slanting through windows that looked out on a city full of people carrying stories they'd never tell. She folded it carefully and placed it in a file labeled Education Materials. She did not write back. Some letters deserve to be received. Not all of them deserve a response. Julian's letter wasn't the point. The point was the 40,000 downloads, the 312 restraining orders, the 17,000 students who'd heard Tessa speak and might recognize a warning sign in their own relationships before it escalated. The point was Mika, the 17-year-old who'd walked into Tessa's office 3 years ago with bruises and a story about stairs. Mika was now 20, studying social work at Ryerson, volunteering at the foundation on weekends. You saved my life, Mika told Tessa one evening as they packed up after a fundraising event. No, Tessa said, you saved mine. You just didn't know it at the time. Could you ever forgive someone who tried to destroy you? Or is the best response simply to build a life so full of purpose that their shadow can't reach you any more? Tessa Obi stood at the podium during the Foundation's second annual gala, held in the same Sick Kids fundraiser venue where she'd met Julian 6 years earlier. The room was full of survivors, advocates, lawyers, police officers, and teenagers from the Rung by Rung program. Her mother sat in the front row, crying the kind of tears that come from watching your child become something extraordinary from something terrible. People ask me if I regret those 5 years, Tessa said. I don't regret surviving them. I regret that survival was necessary. I regret that in this country, in our country, a woman is assaulted by her partner every 6 minutes. I regret that leaving is still more dangerous than staying. But I don't regret the ladder I built. Because every rung I climbed is now a rung someone else can use. She paused and looked out at the audience. If you're in a situation like the one I survived, I need you to hear this. You are not weak, you are not trapped. You are building rungs even if you can't see the ladder yet. And when you're ready, there are people holding it steady for you. The applause didn't feel like celebration. It felt like recognition. Like a room full of people acknowledging that the hardest stories to tell are the ones that need telling most. Outside, Toronto's skyline glittered against a cold March sky. Somewhere in a federal institution, Julian Ashworth was 5 years into his sentence, stripped of his medical license, his reputation, and the illusion that control was the same thing as love. Somewhere on Queen Street West, the Foundation's lights were still on, because someone was always there, answering a call, filing a report, holding a ladder steady. And Tessa Obi was standing in a room full of light, telling her story not because it was over, but because it was finally completely hers. If this story moved you, smash that like button and subscribe to Destined Beyond Hardships for more stories about the power of resilience. Share this with someone who needs to know that no one has to stay on the floor forever. And remember, the strongest thing you can build isn't an empire. It's a ladder out of someone else's darkness.